The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Phoenix as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos checked her gear for the third time. Her hands moved with practiced precision over her M4 carbine, every component familiar as her own heartbeat. The forward operating base in Afghanistan's Nangarhar province buzzed with the controlled chaos of another dawn patrol preparation. "Santos, you're with Alpha Team today," Lieutenant Rodriguez called out, his voice cutting through the pre-mission chatter. "We've got reports of suspicious activity near the village of Qualat. Intelligence suggests possible IED placement along Route Amber." Maria nodded, slinging her rifle across her shoulder. At 28, she had already completed 2 tours in Iraq and was 6 months into her Afghan deployment. Her reputation as one of the finest marksmen in the 82nd Airborne Division preceded her wherever she went. What her fellow soldiers didn't know was that Maria had grown up hunting deer with her grandfather in the mountains of Colorado, learning patience and precision long before the Army ever put a rifle in her hands. The team assembled near the motor pool as the sun climbed higher. Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson, the team leader, gathered his 6-person squad around the hood of their MRAP vehicle. The massive, mine-resistant truck would carry them through the dangerous terrain ahead. "Listen up," Thompson began, spreading a map across the warm metal. "We're checking 3 possible locations where locals reported strange activity. First stop is about 8 clicks north of here, where Route Amber curves around the hillside. Second location is the old school building that's been abandoned since the fighting started. Third is the bridge crossing near the marketplace." Corporal James Wilson, their medic, pointed to the map. "What's the civilian situation looking like today?" "Market day," Thompson replied grimly. "Which means lots of foot traffic, lots of potential cover for bad guys, and lots of innocent people who could get caught in the middle if things go sideways." Private First Class Danny Kim, barely 21 and on his first deployment, shifted nervously. Maria noticed his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his body armor. She remembered her own first patrol in combat. The way fear and adrenaline mixed into something that made your mouth dry and your heart race. "Kim," she called softly, walking over to the young soldier. "You good?" "Yes, Sergeant," he replied quickly, then hesitated. "Actually, no. I mean, I'm ready to do my job, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared." Maria appreciated his honesty. "Good. Being scared keeps you alive. The day you stop being scared is the day you make mistakes that get people killed. Channel that fear into focus." Specialist Robert Hayes, their communications expert, was already running final checks on the radio equipment. He'd been with Thompson's team for over a year and had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense trouble before it happened. Today, something felt different to him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. "Comms check complete," Hayes reported. "We've got clear channels back to base and with the air support on standby." The 6th member of their team was Sergeant First Class Tony Martinez, a combat engineer whose job was to identify and neutralize any explosive devices they might encounter. Martinez had survived 4 IED attacks during his previous deployments and bore the scars to prove it. A piece of shrapnel had left him with a slight limp, but his expertise with explosives was unmatched. As the team performed their final equipment checks, Maria found herself thinking about the letter she'd received from her younger sister the previous day. Elena was starting her senior year of high school and had been accepted to 3 colleges already. She wrote about normal teenage problems, which boy she had a crush on, whether she should try out for the school play, how excited she was about graduation. The contrast between Elena's world and this one struck Maria powerfully. Here, in this dusty corner of Afghanistan, life and death decisions happened in split seconds. Back home, the biggest worry was whether the cafeteria would serve pizza or hamburgers for lunch. Maria carried the responsibility of protecting both worlds, the dangerous one she lived in now, and the peaceful one her family inhabited back in Denver. "Mount up," Thompson called out, and the team climbed into their MRAP. The ride to their first checkpoint took them through terrain that seemed deceptively peaceful. Rolling hills covered in sparse vegetation stretched toward mountains that rose like ancient guardians against the bright blue sky. Goat herders moved their flocks across the landscape, and children played in the yards of mud brick compounds scattered throughout the valley. But Maria's trained eyes caught details that spoke of the danger lurking beneath this pastoral scene. The way certain houses sat empty, their windows dark and doors hanging open. The absence of men between the ages of 16 and 50 in many of the groups they passed. The careful way local people averted their eyes when the American patrol drove by. First location coming up, Hayes announced over the vehicle's intercom. 2 minutes out. Through the thick, bulletproof glass, Maria could see the curve in route amber that intelligence had flagged. The road wound around a rocky outcropping that provided perfect concealment for anyone wanting to plant an explosive device. On the far side of the curve, the route opened up again, but vehicles would be forced to slow down significantly to navigate the turn. Thompson ordered the driver to stop about 300 meters short of the curve. The team would approach on foot, using the natural cover to mask their advance while Martinez scanned for signs of disturbance in the roadway. As they dismounted, Maria automatically took up an overwatch position. Her role as the team's designated marksman meant she would provide security while the others conducted their search. She found a spot behind a large boulder that gave her good visibility in all directions and settled into position. Through her rifle's scope, she began systematically scanning the area. The 4x magnification brought distant details into sharp focus. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermal currents up from the sun-warmed rocks. Insects buzzed in the scrub vegetation. Everything appeared normal. But Maria had learned to trust the feeling that sometimes crept up her spine when something wasn't right. Martinez and Wilson moved forward to examine the roadway, their movements careful and deliberate. They carried metal detectors and other specialized equipment designed to locate hidden explosives. Behind them, Thompson and Hayes maintained security, their weapons ready but not obviously threatening to any locals who might be watching. Kim stayed with the vehicle, his job to monitor the radio and maintain communication with their base. It was a position that kept the newest team member relatively safe while still giving him an important responsibility. 20 minutes into their search, Martinez's metal detector began emitting a steady beeping sound. He held up his hand, signaling for everyone to freeze in place. Maria watched through her scope as he carefully cleared away dirt and debris from the roadway. "Got something here," Martinez's voice crackled over their radio system. "Looks like a pressure plate, probably connected to something bigger buried deeper." Thompson immediately called for everyone to back away from the road, while Martinez worked to identify exactly what they were dealing with. This was the most dangerous part of their job. The moment when they'd found a device but didn't yet know how sophisticated it was, or whether it might be rigged with anti-tampering measures. Maria kept her scope moving, watching for any signs that someone might be observing their activities. IED emplacers sometimes like to watch their handiwork, either to trigger devices remotely or simply to see the effectiveness of their efforts. Her job was to spot any watchers and eliminate them before they could cause harm to her team. The minutes stretched out like hours as Martinez carefully probed the device. Through her scope, Maria could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. This was delicate work that required absolute concentration. One wrong move could detonate the device and kill or injure everyone within the blast radius. "Okay. I've got eyes on the main charge," Martinez finally reported. "This is a big one. Probably 50 pounds of homemade explosive. It's definitely designed to take out a vehicle, maybe multiple vehicles." Thompson made the decision to call for an explosive ordnance disposal team from their base rather than attempt to disarm the device in the field. It was the safe choice, but it meant they would be stuck in position for at least another hour while they waited for the specialists to arrive. Maria adjusted her position slightly, settling in for the extended Overwatch mission. Through her scope, she began to notice something that hadn't been apparent during their initial approach. On a hillside about 600 meters to the east, partially hidden behind a cluster of rocks, something metallic occasionally caught the sunlight. She focused her scope on that area and waited patiently. Her grandfather had taught her that patience was the hunter's greatest weapon. "Don't go looking for the deer," he used to tell her. "Let the deer show itself to you." After 10 minutes of careful observation, her patience was rewarded. A man emerged briefly from behind the rocks, and Maria caught the distinctive outline of an AK-47 rifle in his hands. He appeared to be watching their position, though from that distance he probably couldn't see the details of what Martinez was doing with the IED. "Thompson, we've got a possible spotter on the eastern ridge." she reported quietly over the radio. Single individual with a rifle, approximately 600 meters out. Can you confirm hostile intent? Thompson asked. Maria continued watching. Military rules of engagement required clear evidence of hostile intent before engaging a target. Simply carrying a weapon wasn't enough. In Afghanistan, many civilians carried rifles for protection. She needed to see something that clearly identified this person as a threat. She didn't have to wait long. The man raised his rifle and appeared to be aiming in their direction. Even at 600 meters, Maria could see through her scope that he was taking deliberate aim at her teammates, who were clustered around the IED. Confirmed hostile, she reported. Individual is taking aim at our position. Take the shot, Thompson ordered without hesitation. Maria controlled her breathing, just as her grandfather had taught her decades ago in the Colorado mountains. She found her natural respiratory pause, that moment between exhale and inhale when the body is perfectly still. Her finger found the trigger and applied steady, even pressure. The rifle fired, the shot echoing off the surrounding hills. Through her scope, Maria saw the distant figure drop immediately. At 600 meters, with a crosswind and shooting uphill, it was a difficult shot that required all of her skill and training. Target down, she reported. Martinez was able to complete his preliminary examination of the IED without further interruption. The explosive ordnance disposal team arrived 40 minutes later and safely detonated the device in place. The explosion was massive, confirming that it would have killed everyone in any vehicle unfortunate enough to trigger it. As the team prepared to move to their second checkpoint, Thompson approached Maria. Hell of a shot, Santos. That guy was definitely getting ready to light us up while Martinez was working. Maria nodded. But she felt no satisfaction in taking a life, even one that had threatened her teammates. Each shot fired in combat carried weight, a responsibility that she took seriously. She had ended a threat, but she had also ended a human being. It was a burden that all soldiers carried. The cost of protecting innocent life and completing the mission. The second checkpoint, the abandoned school building, proved to be clear of any threats. The structure had been damaged in fighting several months earlier, and local people had moved their children to other locations for education. Thompson's team conducted a thorough search, but found no signs of recent enemy activity. Their final stop was the bridge near the marketplace, and this location presented entirely different challenges. Unlike the remote roadside where they had found the IED, this area bustled with civilian activity. Vendors sold vegetables, clothing, and household goods from stalls set up along the roadway. Children played between the stalls while their mothers shopped and gossiped. The presence of so many innocent people made security much more complex. Any threat that emerged would have to be identified and neutralized with surgical precision to avoid civilian casualties. Maria positioned herself on a small rise overlooking the marketplace, her rifle ready but kept low to avoid alarming the local population. Martinez began his methodical examination of the bridge structure, while Wilson and Kim questioned local vendors about any suspicious activity they might have observed. Thompson coordinated with Hayes to maintain contact with base and monitor radio traffic for any intelligence updates. The marketplace gradually quieted as word spread that American soldiers were conducting operations in the area. This was typical behavior. Most civilians preferred to avoid any potential trouble by simply leaving when military operations were underway. Within 30 minutes, the busy market had become nearly deserted. It was this sudden change in atmosphere that probably saved their lives. As the last civilian vendors packed up their goods and departed, Maria noticed movement in a building on the far side of the bridge. Through her scope, she could see figures moving purposefully inside what appeared to be an abandoned shop. Their movements suggested military training. They stayed low, used available cover, and moved with the coordination of a team rather than the random activity of civilians. Thompson. Possible multiple hostiles in the building across the bridge, she reported. Count is unclear, but movement suggests organized activity. Thompson immediately ordered Martinez to suspend his search and take cover. The bridge examination would have to wait until they could determine the extent of the threat they were facing. Maria counted at least 4 separate individuals moving within the building. Their positions suggested they were setting up for an ambush, using the windows and doorways to create overlapping fields of fire that would cover the bridge and the approaches to it. Looks like they're preparing an ambush, she continued her report. Multiple positions, coordinated setup. They're definitely waiting for us to move onto the bridge. This was exactly the kind of situation that could result in multiple American casualties. The bridge offered no cover once they were committed to crossing it. If the enemy team was allowed to initiate the ambush, Thompson's squad would be caught in the open with nowhere to hide. The tactical situation required immediate action to prevent the ambush from being sprung. Thompson made the decision to call for air support, but the nearest attack helicopter was 20 minutes away, too long to wait when facing an imminent threat. "Santos, can you disrupt their setup?" Thompson asked. Maria studied the building through her scope. 600 meters again, similar to her earlier shot, but this situation was far more complex. Instead of a single target in the open, she was looking at multiple targets, using cover and concealment inside a structure. Her first priority was to identify the enemy team leader, or anyone who appeared to be coordinating their activities. Eliminating the leader could disrupt their coordination and buy time for her teammates to reach better positions. Through patient observation, she identified one individual who appeared to be moving between positions and directing the others. He carried himself with the confidence of someone in command, and occasionally used hand signals to communicate with the other fighters. Maria made her decision. Taking out the leader first would maximize the chance of disrupting their entire operation. She found her shooting position, controlled her breathing, and waited for the target to present himself. Clearly, the shot, when it came, was even more difficult than her earlier one. The target was partially concealed by the building's window frame, and she had only a brief moment when his profile was clear enough to guarantee a clean hit. Her rifle fired, and through the scope she saw the figure drop immediately. The effect on the remaining fighters was immediate and dramatic. Instead of maintaining their coordinated ambush positions, they began moving frantically within the building. The loss of their leader had clearly disrupted their plan and created confusion about what to do next. "Leader down," Maria reported. Remaining hostiles appeared disorganized. This gave Thompson the opportunity he needed to reposition his team and call in accurate coordinates for the incoming air support. By the time the attack helicopter arrived, the surviving enemy fighters had either fled the building or been neutralized by Maria's continued precision fire. The bridge was eventually cleared and found to be free of explosives. Martinez determined that the enemy team had probably been planning to attack Thompson's squad during their search, rather than relying on a planted device. As Alpha Team loaded back into their MRAP for the return journey to Camp Phoenix, each member was acutely aware of how differently the day could have ended. Without Maria's vigilance and marksmanship, they would likely have walked into a carefully planned ambush that could have resulted in multiple casualties or deaths. But the real test of the day's events was yet to come. Back at base, Maria's actions would be scrutinized by officers who had not been present during the firefight. Questions would be asked about her decision-making, her adherence to rules of engagement, and whether the level of force she had used was appropriate for the situations she had faced. Thompson began mentally preparing for the after-action reports he would need to file. He knew that Maria had saved lives today, but he also knew that every shot fired by an American soldier in Afghanistan was subject to intense review by multiple levels of command. The long ride back to base gave each team member time to process what had happened. For Kim, it had been his first real combat experience, and he was still coming to terms with how quickly peaceful situations could turn deadly. Hayes was already thinking about the intelligence value of the sites they had found and the patterns that might emerge from analyzing the day's events. Martinez was simply grateful to be alive. His work with explosives put him at constant risk, and having teammates like Maria watching his back made the difference between coming home safe and becoming another casualty statistic. For Maria herself, the ride home was a time for reflection. She had fired her rifle twice in combat today and had taken at least one confirmed life, possibly more. Each shot had been necessary to protect her teammates and civilians, but that knowledge didn't make the weight of responsibility any lighter. As Camp Phoenix came into view, Maria could see the flags flying over the headquarters building and the antenna arrays that maintained communication with the outside world. Soon, her actions would be reported up the chain of command, analyzed by officers who had never been in her position, and judged according to standards that sometimes seemed divorced from the realities of combat. But for now, all 6 members of Alpha Team were alive and unhurt. In the dangerous world of military operations in Afghanistan, that alone represented a successful mission. The real challenges would begin when they had to explain and justify every decision they had made during their day outside the wire. The debriefing room at Camp Phoenix felt smaller than usual as Alpha Team filed in for their after-action review. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on the faces of the 6 soldiers who had returned from what should have been a routine patrol. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos took her seat at the metal table, her hands steady despite the scrutiny she knew was coming. Major Patricia Coleman, the battalion intelligence officer, spread several manila folders across the table. Her expression was unreadable as she looked at each team member in turn. Major Coleman had a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsession, and she approached every combat incident with the methodical precision of a forensic investigator. "Let's start from the beginning," she said, opening the first folder. "Staff Sergeant Thompson, walk me through the mission parameters and your initial observations." Thompson straightened in his chair and began his report. He described the intelligence briefing, the route they had taken, and the discovery of the IED at the first location. His account was precise and factual, sticking to observable details rather than interpretations or assumptions. Maria listened carefully as each team member provided their portion of the report. She knew that her actions would be the primary focus of the investigation, but she also understood that everything her teammates said would either support or undermine her position when the questions turned to her use of lethal force. When Thompson reached the point where Maria had identified the first hostile target, Major Coleman held up her hand to stop him. She turned to face Maria directly, her eyes hard and calculating. "Staff Sergeant Santos, tell me about your first engagement. What specifically did you observe that indicated hostile intent?" Maria had rehearsed this moment during the ride back to base. She knew that her answer needed to be precise, factual, and legally defensible. The rules of engagement were clear, but their application in real-world situations often involved split-second decisions based on incomplete information. At approximately 0, 9, 4, 7 hours, I observed a single individual on the eastern ridge, approximately 600 meters from our position, Maria began. The individual was carrying what appeared to be an AK-47 rifle and was positioned behind cover that provided concealment from casual observation. "Possession of a weapon alone doesn't constitute hostile intent," Major Coleman interrupted. "What else did you see?" "I maintained observation for approximately 10 minutes. During that time, the individual remained focused on our position while my teammates were conducting their explosive ordnance examination. At 0957 hours, I observed the individual assume a firing position and aim his weapon toward our location where Sergeant Martinez was working." Major Coleman made notes in her folder. "How certain are you that he was aiming at your position rather than simply adjusting his weapon or scanning the area?" Maria had anticipated this question. "I could clearly see through my optic that he had brought his weapon to his shoulder and was using the sights to aim. His body position was consistent with someone preparing to fire. Given the tactical situation, with my teammates exposed while working on an explosive device, I assessed that waiting for him to actually fire would have resulted in American casualties." "And your assessment of range and shooting conditions?" 600 meters. Slight crosswind from the southwest, shooting uphill with approximately 15 degrees of elevation. Within my effective engagement range for the weapon system and ammunition I was using. Major Coleman turned to Thompson. "Did you personally observe this individual before authorizing engagement?" Thompson shook his head. "No, ma'am. I was focused on providing local security while Martinez worked. I relied on Staff Sergeant Santos's assessment of the threat. When she reported a confirmed hostile taking aim at our position, I authorized engagement." "So your authorization was based entirely on Santos's interpretation of what she was seeing?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Thompson felt the weight of command responsibility settling on his shoulders. Every decision made by his team members ultimately reflected on his leadership, but he had learned long ago that second-guessing his soldiers' expertise in the field led to hesitation that got people killed. "Yes, ma'am. Staff Sergeant Santos is our designated marksman and has extensive training in threat identification. Her position gave her the best observation angle, and her assessment of hostile intent was clear and definitive. Under the circumstances, with my team exposed and vulnerable, I trusted her judgment. Major Coleman made more notes, then shifted her attention to the second engagement. Let's discuss the incident at the marketplace. Santos, describe your observations of the building across the bridge. Maria recounted her identification of multiple individuals moving within the abandoned shop. She described their coordinated movements, their use of cover and concealment, and the tactical positions they appeared to be establishing. When she reached the point where she had engaged what appeared to be the enemy team leader, Major Coleman's questions became even more pointed. You made a decision to engage targets inside a building in a civilian area. What was your assessment of the risk to non-combatants? The marketplace had cleared of civilians approximately 20 minutes before I engaged. My teammates had confirmed that the area was clear of non-combatants. The individuals I observed in the building were clearly not civilians, based on their movements and tactical positioning. But you couldn't positively identify weapons from your position? Maria paused, choosing her words carefully. The individual I engaged first was partially concealed by the building structure. However, his movements and positioning were consistent with someone directing an ambush. The tactical situation indicated that immediate action was necessary to prevent my teammates from being caught in a coordinated attack. Major Coleman leaned back in her chair, studying Maria's face. So both of your engagements were based on behavioral assessment rather than clear observation of imminent attack? The question was a trap, Maria realized. Military lawyers and investigators love to focus on the precise moment when hostile intent became legally actionable. They wanted clear, unambiguous evidence that would stand up to review by people who had never faced the reality of combat decision-making. Ma'am, both engagements were based on the totality of observed behavior in tactical contexts, where my teammates were vulnerable to attack. In the first case, I observed an individual take aim with a weapon at my exposed teammates. In the second case, I observed coordinated movement consistent with an imminent ambush. In both situations, waiting for the enemy to initiate contact would likely have resulted in American casualties. Major Coleman closed her folder and stood up. This investigation will continue. All team members are restricted to base pending completion of the review. Staff Sergeant Santos, you're relieved of duty pending the outcome. The words hit Maria like a physical blow. Being relieved of duty was one step away from formal charges, and it meant that her superiors had serious doubts about her actions. As the team filed out of the debriefing room, the weight of what was happening began to settle on her shoulders. Back in her quarters, Maria stared at the letters from home that had accumulated on her small desk. Her sister Elena had written about the homecoming dance and her excitement about college applications. Her mother had sent news about the family business and updates about relatives and friends. Her grandfather had included a photograph from his latest hunting trip, standing proudly next to a magnificent elk he had taken with a single, well-placed shot. The contrast between these reminders of home and her current situation felt surreal. Here she was, facing potential criminal charges for doing exactly what her training and experience had prepared her to do. She had protected her teammates and potentially saved civilian lives. But the very system she served was now questioning whether her actions had been legally justified. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Corporal Wilson stood in the hallway, looking uncomfortable but determined. Sergeant, I wanted you to know that we're all behind you on this. What you did out there saved our lives, and everyone knows it. Thanks, Wilson. I appreciate that. Is there anything we can do? I mean, we were all there. Maria shook her head. Just tell the truth when they interview you. Don't try to make it sound better or worse than it was. The facts are what they are. After Wilson left, Maria tried to focus on writing a letter to her family, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain that she was under investigation for actions that had prevented American deaths? How could she make them understand the impossible position that soldiers faced when split-second decisions were later analyzed by people who had never been in combat? The next morning brought a new development that changed everything. Intelligence reports from the night revealed that the insurgent group they had encountered was part of a larger cell planning a coordinated attack on American forces. The building where Maria had engaged the second group contained detailed maps of Camp Phoenix and timeline information for a planned assault on the base. Major Coleman called Maria to her office to discuss these new findings. The intelligence officer's demeanor was noticeably different from the previous day's interrogation. Staff Sergeant Santos, new information has come to light regarding yesterday's engagements. It appears that both locations you engaged were part of a larger operational plan targeting American forces. Maria remained silent, waiting to see where this conversation was heading. The individual you engaged at the first location was carrying a radio that was tuned to the same frequency being used by the group at the marketplace. It appears they were coordinating a combined attack that would have caught your patrol in a crossfire between the IED location and the bridge ambush. This new information cast Maria's actions in a completely different light. Instead of two separate encounters with isolated threats, it now appeared that she had disrupted a sophisticated, coordinated attack that could have resulted in significant American casualties. Furthermore, Major Coleman continued, the maps and documents recovered from the building at the marketplace indicate that this group had been conducting surveillance of our base for several weeks. They had identified patrol routes, timing patterns, and security vulnerabilities. Maria felt a mix of relief and vindication, but she was careful not to show it. Military investigations often took unexpected turns, and she had learned not to assume anything until the final reports were signed. Where does this leave the investigation? She asked. The tactical intelligence suggests that your actions disrupted a significant threat to American forces. However, the legal questions about your adherence to rules of engagement remain under review. Major Coleman paused, choosing her words carefully. There's something else. We've received a request from higher headquarters for a complete briefing on yesterday's actions. Apparently, someone at division level has taken an interest in this case. The mention of division-level attention sent a chill down Maria's spine. Division commanders didn't typically involve themselves in individual soldier investigations unless there were significant political or legal implications. Either she was in much more trouble than she had realized, or something else was driving the interest from higher command. Can you tell me what kind of interest? I don't have those details yet. What I can tell you is that you're to report to the division headquarters tomorrow morning for what's being called an administrative review. You'll be accompanied by a legal representative. The involvement of lawyers confirmed Maria's worst fears. Administrative reviews that required legal representation were serious affairs that could result in court-martial proceedings, reduction in rank, or discharge from the military. Everything she had worked for in her 10-year Army career was now at risk because of split-second decisions made under combat conditions. That evening, Maria called her family using the base's communication system. She spoke to her mother first, trying to keep the conversation light and avoiding any mention of her current situation. Her mother could always sense when something was wrong, though, and the questions came quickly. Maria, you sound different. Is everything okay over there? I'm fine, Mom. Just tired from some long days. You're not telling me something. I can hear it in your voice. Maria struggled with how much to share. Her family worried enough about her deployment without adding concerns about legal troubles. But she also knew that if news of the investigation became public, they would hear about it eventually. There's been some questions about a mission I was on recently. Nothing serious. Just paperwork and procedures. You know how the Army is about documentation. No, it wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Maria hated not being completely honest with her mother, but she couldn't bear the thought of her family worrying about things they couldn't understand or control. When Elena came on the line, her excitement about ordinary teenage concerns provided a welcome distraction. She talked about her latest school project, the college applications she was working on, and the boy she had invited to the homecoming dance. The normalcy of Elena's world felt like a gift that Maria wanted to preserve and protect. After the call ended, Maria lay on her narrow military cot and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the base perimeter, the war continued. Insurgents planned attacks, intelligence officers analyzed threats, and soldiers prepared for missions that would test their training, courage, and judgment. She had been part of that cycle for months, but now she found herself on the outside, waiting for others to decide whether her service would continue or end in disgrace. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had joined the army to serve her country and protect people like her family from the kind of violence and chaos she saw every day in Afghanistan. Now, the very organization she served was questioning whether she had been too aggressive in carrying out that mission. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of distant rifle shots and the faces of the men she had killed. In the dreams, they weren't insurgents planning attacks on Americans. They were someone's sons and brothers. People with families and hopes and fears just like her own. She woke several times, sweating despite the cool night air. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, with clouds hanging low over the mountains surrounding Camp Phoenix. Maria dressed carefully in her best uniform, knowing that appearance and bearing would be part of the impression she made at division headquarters. She had learned long ago that the military was as much about perception as reality, and today both her career and her freedom might depend on how she presented herself. The helicopter ride to division headquarters took 45 minutes, flying over terrain that looked peaceful from the air but concealed the daily reality of insurgent activity and coalition operations. Maria used the flight time to mentally prepare for whatever questions and challenges awaited her. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the legal officer assigned to represent her, briefed Maria during the flight. Captain Mitchell was young but had a reputation for thorough preparation and aggressive advocacy for her clients. She had reviewed the case file and spoke with confidence about Maria's legal position. Based on the evidence and the tactical situation you faced, I believe your actions were clearly justified under the rules of engagement, Captain Mitchell said over the helicopter's intercom. The challenge will be convincing people who weren't there that you made the right decisions with the information available to you. What's the worst-case scenario? Maria asked. Court-martial for violation of rules of engagement, which could result in imprisonment, dishonorable discharge, and loss of all benefits. But frankly, I don't think that's where this is heading. The intelligence findings have strengthened your position significantly. And the best case? Complete exoneration. Possible commendation for actions that prevented American casualties and disrupted a significant threat. As the helicopter approached the division headquarters, Maria could see the sprawling complex of buildings and facilities that housed the command structure for military operations throughout the region. Somewhere in those buildings, senior officers were making decisions that would affect thousands of soldiers and the overall course of the war in Afghanistan. Soon, one of those decisions would determine her fate. After 10 years of faithful service, 2 previous deployments, and a spotless record, her career would be judged based on 2 rifle shots fired in defense of her teammates during a few crucial minutes on a dusty road in Afghanistan. The helicopter touched down on the landing pad, and Maria stepped out into an uncertain future. The division headquarters building loomed like a fortress against the Afghan sky, its concrete walls and razor wire perimeter speaking to the constant security concerns that dominated military life in the combat zone. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos walked through the metal detectors and security checkpoints with Captain Mitchell at her side, each step taking her closer to a reckoning that would determine not just her future, but possibly set precedents for how soldiers in similar situations would be judged. The conference room where her hearing would take place occupied the 3rd floor of the main building. Large windows offered views of the surrounding mountains, but heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light. The room felt sterile and intimidating, designed to emphasize the gravity of formal military proceedings. Colonel James Harrison, the division's chief of staff, sat at the head of a polished wooden table. His silver hair and weathered face spoke of 3 decades in the Army, including multiple combat deployments dating back to the Gulf War. Flanking him were Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torres, the staff judge advocate, and Major David Kim, the division intelligence officer who had compiled the latest reports on the insurgent cell Maria had engaged. Maria took her assigned seat across from the panel of officers, with Captain Mitchell positioned beside her. The formal nature of the proceedings felt surreal after months of living in the informal, practical environment of forward operating bases where survival mattered more than protocol. Staff Sergeant Santos, Colonel Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority of command. This hearing is being conducted to review your actions during the patrol of October 15th and determine whether those actions were consistent with military law, rules of engagement, and Army standards. Yes, sir, Maria replied, keeping her voice steady despite the tension she felt. Before we begin examining the specifics of your engagement decisions, I want to make it clear that this is not a court-martial proceeding. However, the findings of this review could result in recommendations for further action, including potential criminal charges. The colonel opened a thick manila folder and began reading from what Maria assumed was an official summary of the incident. His recitation of facts was clinical and precise, but it failed to capture the life and death urgency of the situations she had faced in the field. At approximately 0957 hours on October 15th, you engaged a single individual at a range of approximately 600 meters with one round from your M4 rifle. The target was reportedly observing your patrol's activities and appeared to be taking aim at your position. Is this accurate? Yes, sir. The individual had assumed a firing position and was aiming toward our location where Sergeant Martinez was conducting explosive ordnance examination. Lieutenant Colonel Torres leaned forward. Staff Sergeant, walk us through your decision-making process. What specific indicators convinced you that this individual posed an imminent threat? Maria had rehearsed this explanation multiple times, but she knew that her career might depend on how convincingly she could articulate the rapid threat assessment that combat situations demanded. Military lawyers and senior officers who made decisions from the safety of headquarters sometimes struggled to understand the split-second nature of battlefield judgments. Ma'am, I had maintained observation of this individual for approximately 10 minutes. His position provided concealment from casual observation, suggesting tactical knowledge. He remained focused on our location throughout that time rather than moving through the area as a civilian might. When he assumed a firing position and brought his weapon to bear on our location, I assessed that waiting for him to fire would likely result in American casualties. Did you consider the possibility that this individual might have been a civilian defending his property or simply observing your activities out of curiosity? The question struck at the heart of the moral and legal complexity that defined modern counterinsurgency warfare. In a conventional conflict between uniformed armies, threat identification was relatively straightforward. In Afghanistan, the line between combatant and civilian was often blurred, and soldiers faced the impossible task of making life and death decisions based on behavior rather than clear visual identification. Ma'am, I considered that possibility throughout my observation period. However, the individual's tactical positioning, sustained focus on our activities, and ultimately his assumption of a firing position convinced me that he represented a clear threat to my teammates. Major Kim consulted a document in his folder. Staff Sergeant Santos. Intelligence analysis of the radio equipment recovered from this individual confirms that he was in communication with the insurgent cell at the marketplace. This suggests that your assessment of him as a combatant was correct. The revelation provided crucial support for Maria's position, but she knew that hindsight intelligence couldn't completely justify actions that had to be evaluated based on the information available at the moment of decision. Colonel Harrison shifted his attention to the second engagement. Let's discuss the incident at the marketplace. You engaged multiple targets in a building within a populated civilian area. Explain your assessment of the tactical situation. Maria described her observation of coordinated movement within the abandoned building, the positioning that suggested preparation for an ambush, and her decision to engage what appeared to be the team leader in order to disrupt their coordination. The marketplace had cleared of civilians by the time I engaged, she continued. My teammates had confirmed that non-combatants were not in the immediate area. The individuals I observed in the building were moving with tactical coordination that indicated military training. Lieutenant Colonel Torres made notes as Maria spoke. You made a decision to engage targets without clear visual confirmation of weapons. How do you justify that level of force? Ma'am, the tactical situation indicated that my teammates were about to be caught in a coordinated ambush. The bridge offered no cover once they committed to crossing it. Based on the movement patterns I observed and the tactical positioning of multiple individuals, I assessed that immediate action was necessary to prevent American casualties. Major Kim presented additional intelligence findings that supported Maria's assessment. The maps and documents recovered from the building revealed detailed surveillance of American patrol routes and timing. Communications equipment found at the site was tuned to frequencies used by known insurgent groups. Most significantly, the plans indicated that the attack was intended to be synchronized with the IED that Martinez had discovered earlier, The intelligence picture suggests that Staff Sergeant Santos disrupted a sophisticated, coordinated attack that could have resulted in multiple American casualties, Major Kim reported. The insurgent cell had been planning this operation for several weeks and had identified vulnerabilities in our patrol patterns. Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, considering the information presented. Staff Sergeant Santos, your actions appear to have prevented a significant attack on American forces. However, the legal standard for engagement requires imminent threat, not potential threat. How do you reconcile your decision to engage with the rules of engagement? This was the crucial question, Maria realized. Military law required clear evidence of imminent threat before deadly force could be used. The intelligence findings supported her tactical assessment, but legal justification required proof that the threat was immediate rather than potential. Sir, in both cases, I observed behavior that indicated imminent attack on American forces. In the first engagement, the individual assumed a firing position and aimed at our location. In the second engagement, multiple individuals were positioned to initiate an ambush once my teammates moved onto the bridge. Waiting for them to actually begin firing would have resulted in American casualties. Captain Mitchell stood to address the panel. Colonel, if I may, the rules of engagement specifically allow for engagement of hostile forces based on demonstrated intent. Staff Sergeant Santos observed clear indicators of hostile intent in both cases. The intelligence findings confirm that her assessment was tactically and factually correct. Lieutenant Colonel Torres nodded. Captain Mitchell raises a valid point. However, the burden of proof for demonstrated intent is significant. We must be certain that the force used was proportional and necessary. The hearing continued for another 2 hours, with the panel examining every aspect of Maria's actions and decision-making process. They questioned her training, her experience, her understanding of the rules of engagement, and her assessment of the tactical situations she had faced. Throughout the questioning, Maria maintained her composure and provided detailed, factual responses. She acknowledged the gravity of taking human life while standing firmly behind her assessment that her actions had been necessary to protect American forces. As the formal hearing concluded, Colonel Harrison announced that the panel would deliberate and provide their findings within 48 hours. Maria would remain on restricted duty at division headquarters pending their decision. The waiting period felt like an eternity. Maria was assigned quarters in the transient billeting facility and told to remain available for any follow-up questions that might arise. Captain Mitchell used the time to prepare additional documentation supporting Maria's case, but there was little they could do except wait for the panel's decision. On the second day, Major Kim approached Maria in the dining facility, where she was picking at a lunch she had no appetite for. His expression was unreadable as he sat down across from her. Staff Sergeant Santos, I wanted you to know that additional intelligence has come in regarding the insurgent cell you engaged. Maria looked up from her untouched food. What kind of intelligence? Detainees captured during follow-up operations have provided information about the planned attack. According to their statements, the operation was intended to capture American prisoners as well as inflict casualties. The IED was designed to disable vehicles, and the ambush at the bridge was meant to pin down survivors for capture. The implications of this information hit Maria immediately. Capture by insurgent forces often meant torture, execution, or use as propaganda tools. Her actions hadn't just prevented American casualties, they had potentially saved her teammates from a fate worse than death. Has this information been provided to the review panel? It's being briefed to them this afternoon, Major Kim confirmed. I thought you should know. That evening, Captain Mitchell informed Maria that the panel had reached their decision and would announce their findings the next morning. The final night of waiting was the longest of Maria's life. She lay awake thinking about her family, her teammates, and the path that had led her to this moment. Her grandfather had taught her to accept responsibility for her actions, whether hunting in the Colorado mountains or facing life's more serious challenges. She had made the best decisions she could with the information available to her, and she would accept whatever consequences resulted from those choices. The next morning, Maria dressed in her best uniform one final time and reported to the conference room where her fate would be decided. The same panel of officers was assembled, but their demeanor seemed different from the previous sessions. Colonel Harrison's expression was serious but not hostile. and Lieutenant Colonel Torres appeared almost sympathetic. Staff Sergeant Santos, Colonel Harrison began. This panel has carefully reviewed your actions during the patrol of October 15th, including your adherence to rules of engagement, your tactical decision-making, and the ultimate results of your actions. Maria stood at attention, her heart racing despite her outward calm. Based on our review of all available evidence, including intelligence findings and statements from your teammates, this panel finds that your actions were consistent with military law and rules of engagement. Your use of deadly force was justified by the imminent threat to American forces, and your tactical decisions demonstrated sound judgment under combat conditions. Relief flooded through Maria, but she maintained her military bearing as Colonel Harrison continued. Furthermore, this panel finds that your actions likely prevented significant American casualties and disrupted a planned attack on coalition forces. Your marksmanship and tactical awareness reflect credit upon yourself, your unit, and the United States Army. The formal language couldn't completely mask the significance of what was being said. Not only was she being cleared of any wrongdoing, but her actions were being recognized as commendable. However, the colonel continued, and Maria's heart skipped a beat. There are larger questions raised by this incident that require further consideration at higher levels of command. Lieutenant Colonel Torres spoke for the first time that morning. Staff Sergeant Santos, your case has attracted attention from officials outside the military chain of command. There are questions about rules of engagement, the legal framework for counterinsurgency operations, and the broader implications of split-second battlefield decisions. Major Kim added, while this panel has cleared you of any wrongdoing, there may be additional reviews and hearings as your case is examined for policy implications. Colonel Harrison stood, indicating that the formal portion of the hearing was concluded. Staff Sergeant Santos, you are hereby returned to full-duty status. However, you will remain at division headquarters for the time being pending further developments. As Maria left the conference room, she felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The immediate threat of criminal charges had been lifted, but it appeared that her case was far from over. Higher authorities were apparently using her situation to examine larger questions about military policy and rules of engagement. Captain Mitchell walked with her toward the billeting area, explaining what the panel's decision meant in practical terms. You're completely cleared of any criminal wrongdoing, she said. The panel's findings are strongly supportive of your actions. However, it sounds like this case might be headed for review at the Pentagon level. What does that mean for me? Honestly, I'm not sure. It could mean anything, from additional commendations to being called to testify before Congress about rules of engagement. Your case seems to have become a test case for how we evaluate soldier decision-making in complex counterinsurgency environments. As they walked, Maria reflected on the irony of her situation. She had simply done her job as she had been trained to do, protecting her teammates and completing the mission. Now, those same actions were being scrutinized by people far removed from the realities of combat, as examples of larger policy questions about American military operations. Whatever came next, Maria knew that she had acted with integrity and courage when it mattered most. 6 American soldiers had come home alive because of her vigilance and marksmanship. In the end, that was what truly counted, regardless of what policymakers and politicians might decide about the broader implications of her actions. The mountains surrounding the division headquarters looked the same as they had when she arrived, but Maria's perspective had changed completely. She was no longer a soldier facing potential court-martial, but she wasn't entirely free either. She was now part of a larger conversation about the nature of modern warfare and the impossible decisions that soldiers faced in the gray areas between peace and war. As the sun set behind the peaks, Maria Santos prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that her actions had already passed the most important test of all. They had saved the lives of the soldiers who depended on her. 3 days after her exoneration, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos found herself in the most unlikely place she could have imagined, sitting in the back of a military transport aircraft bound for Washington, D.C. The order had come down from levels so high in the chain of command that even Colonel Harrison seemed surprised by the sudden development. Captain Mitchell sat across from her in the cargo bay of the C-130, shouting over the engine noise to explain what little she knew about their destination. Pentagon officials want to interview you about your case. Apparently, your situation has become part of a larger review of rules of engagement and tactical decision-making protocols. Maria stared out the small window at the landscape passing below, wondering how her routine patrol in Afghanistan had escalated into a matter of national policy. The transition from potential court-martial defendant to Pentagon witness felt surreal, like stepping through a looking glass into a world where her split-second combat decisions were being analyzed by people who had never heard a shot fired in anger. The flight took them first to a base in Germany for refueling, then across the Atlantic to Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington. Each mile traveled took Maria further from the simple reality of combat operations and deeper into the complex world of military policy and political considerations that shaped how wars were fought. At Andrews, they were met by a protocol officer who escorted them to a black sedan for the drive into the capital. Maria had never been to Washington before, and she found herself staring at the monuments and government buildings that she had only seen in photographs. The city represented the highest levels of American power and decision-making, yet it felt completely disconnected from the dusty forward operating bases where those decisions played out in life and death terms. Their destination was the Pentagon, the massive five-sided building that served as headquarters for the Department of Defense. Maria had heard about the Pentagon her entire military career, but actually walking through its corridors felt like entering the brain center of American military power. Officers and civilians moved purposefully through hallways lined with portraits of military leaders and displays of military history. The office where Maria's interview would take place belonged to General Robert Chen, a three-star officer who served as the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. General Chen was a distinguished veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, who had risen through the ranks based on his tactical brilliance and strategic thinking. His involvement suggested that Maria's case had implications far beyond a single soldier's actions. The general's office was larger than most apartments Maria had lived in, with windows overlooking the Potomac River and walls decorated with military awards, unit flags, and photographs from various deployments. General Chen himself was smaller than Maria had expected, but his presence filled the room with quiet authority. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he said, standing to greet her. "Thank you for making this trip. I know this must be a confusing time for you." "Yes, sir. I'm not entirely sure why I'm here." General Chen smiled. "That's understandable. Your case has raised some important questions about how we prepare our soldiers for the complex situations they face in modern warfare. We'd like to discuss your experience and get your perspective on some policy issues." Also present in the room were Colonel Sandra Williams, a military lawyer who specialized in rules of engagement issues, and Dr. Michael Foster, a civilian analyst from the Defense Department who studied soldier decision-making under combat stress. Captain Mitchell sat beside Maria, ready to intervene if the questioning moved in directions that might be legally problematic. "Let's start with your background," General Chen began. "Tell me about your training as a designated marksman and your previous combat experience." Maria recounted her military career, from her initial enlistment through her specialized marksmanship training and her previous deployments to Iraq. She described the additional training she had received in threat identification, rules of engagement, and civilian protection protocols. "Your record shows exceptional marksmanship scores and commendations for performance under fire," Colonel Williams noted. "You're clearly well-trained and experienced. But training can't prepare soldiers for every situation they might face in the field." "No, ma'am. Training provides a foundation. But every tactical situation is unique. Soldiers have to make decisions based on their training, their experience, and their assessment of the immediate threat." Dr. Foster leaned forward. "That's exactly what we're interested in discussing. Your case illustrates the challenge that soldiers face when rules designed for conventional warfare are applied to counterinsurgency environments. Can you describe the thought process you went through when you identified the first target?" Maria explained her systematic observation of the individual on the ridge, her assessment of his behavior and positioning, and her conclusion that he represented an imminent threat to her teammates. She emphasized that her decision was based on the totality of observed behavior rather than any single indicator. "The challenge," General Chen observed, "is that your decision had to be made in seconds. but it's being evaluated by people who have hours or days to analyze every detail. How do we bridge that gap between battlefield reality and legal requirements? It was a question that went to the heart of modern military operations, Maria realized. The general wasn't just asking about her specific case. He was asking about fundamental problems in how military force was regulated and controlled in complex environments like Afghanistan. Sir, I think the key is trusting soldiers to make good decisions based on their training and experience. If we second-guess every tactical decision made under combat conditions, we're essentially asking soldiers to choose between mission accomplishment and legal protection. Colonel Williams nodded. That's exactly the dilemma we're facing. How do we maintain appropriate legal and ethical standards while still allowing soldiers the flexibility to protect themselves and accomplish their missions? The conversation continued for over 2 hours, covering not just the specifics of Maria's case but broader questions about military training, rules of engagement, and the legal framework for modern warfare. Maria found herself discussing topics she had never considered from a policy perspective, even though she had lived with their practical implications every day in Afghanistan. As the formal interview concluded, General Chen made an unexpected announcement. Staff Sergeant Santos, I want to offer you an opportunity. We're forming a working group to review and potentially revise our rules of engagement and tactical decision-making protocols. Your experience and perspective would be valuable to that effort. The offer was both flattering and daunting. It would mean extended assignment in Washington, working on policy issues that could affect thousands of soldiers. But it would also mean leaving the operational military that Maria had always known and entering the world of bureaucracy and politics. What would that assignment entail, sir? Oh, you'd work with legal experts, training specialists, and experienced officers to develop improved guidelines for soldiers facing the kinds of situations you encountered. Your practical experience would help ensure that our policies reflect battlefield realities. Captain Mitchell spoke for the first time during the interview. Sir, would Staff Sergeant Santos be able to consult with her current chain of command and consider this opportunity? Of course. This is a significant decision that could affect her entire career trajectory. Take whatever time you need. As they left the Pentagon, Maria felt overwhelmed by the sudden expansion of her horizons. A week ago, she had been facing potential court-martial. Now, she was being offered the chance to influence military policy at the highest levels. The transition felt like whiplash. That evening, in a hotel room near the Pentagon, Maria called her family to share what she could about the day's developments. Her mother was proud but worried about the implications of such high-level attention. Elena was excited about her sister being in Washington and wanted to know if she had met any famous people. I met a general who makes decisions about how the whole army operates, Maria told her sister. But he seemed more interested in what I thought than in impressing me with his rank. Are you going to take the job he offered? It was a simple question with complex implications. Accepting the assignment would mean leaving operational units and entering a world where her combat experience would be valuable, but where the daily reality would be very different from what she had known. It would also mean staying in the United States for an extended period, giving her more time with family but less time doing the job she had trained for. I don't know yet. It's a big decision. The next morning brought another surprise. Maria was contacted by a reporter from the Washington Post who had learned about her case and wanted to interview her about rules of engagement issues. The request came through official channels, indicating that military leadership was supportive of media coverage. The interview took place in a coffee shop near the Pentagon, a setting that felt strange for discussing life and death decisions made in Afghan combat zones. The reporter, Sarah Chen, was knowledgeable about military affairs and asked thoughtful questions about the challenges soldiers faced in complex tactical situations. Your case has become a symbol of the impossible decisions that soldiers face in modern warfare, Sarah observed. How do you feel about being in that position? I never intended to become a symbol of anything, Maria replied. I was just doing my job and trying to protect my teammates. If my experience can help other soldiers avoid the kinds of legal questions I faced, then I suppose that's worthwhile. Do you think the current rules of engagement are adequate for the situations soldiers actually encounter? Maria chose her words carefully. I think the rules are well-intentioned, but they were written by people who may not fully understand the split-second nature of combat decisions. There's a difference between having time to analyze a situation and having seconds to prevent American casualties. The article, which appeared 2 days later, presented Maria's case as an example of broader issues facing the military in counterinsurgency environments. It quoted military experts who argued for more flexibility in rules of engagement, and critics who worried about civilian casualties if soldiers were given too much discretion. The media attention brought both positive and negative responses. Some veterans organizations praised Maria's actions and called for reforms to protect soldiers who made difficult decisions under combat conditions. Critics argued that loosening engagement rules would lead to increased civilian casualties and damage America's reputation internationally. Within the military, reaction was mixed as well. Many soldiers and junior officers supported Maria's position, having faced similar situations themselves. Some senior officers worried about the precedent of publicly discussing rules of engagement and the potential impact on military discipline. As the debate continued in newspapers and online forums, Maria found herself at the center of a national conversation about military policy and the nature of modern warfare. It was a position she had never sought and wasn't entirely comfortable occupying. The decision about the Pentagon assignment became more pressing as the media attention intensified. General Chen called personally to discuss the opportunity and the timeline for a decision. Staff Sergeant Santos, I want you to know that this offer is based entirely on your qualifications and experience, not on the media attention your case has received. Your perspective would be valuable regardless of any public interest in your situation. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that clarification. However, I should also mention that your case has accelerated some policy discussions that were already underway. There's a real opportunity here to make meaningful improvements in how we prepare soldiers for complex tactical situations. The general's words carried weight. But Maria remained uncertain about leaving operational military service for a policy role. She had become a soldier to serve in the field, not to work in Washington offices. Yet she also recognized that policy decisions made in those offices directly affected soldiers like her teammates who were still in Afghanistan. A conversation with Staff Sergeant Thompson, who called from Afghanistan, helped clarify her thinking. Santos, you saved our lives out here. If you can help prevent other soldiers from facing the kinds of legal problems you went through, that would be another way of protecting troops. Thompson's words resonated with Maria's fundamental motivation for military service. Protecting others. Whether that protection came through accurate marksmanship on Afghan hillsides or through improved policies developed in Pentagon offices, the ultimate goal remained the same. The next morning, Maria called General Chen's office to accept the assignment. Within hours, the wheels of military bureaucracy began turning to arrange her transfer and the clearances she would need for her new role. As she prepared to leave Washington for a brief return to Afghanistan to close out her deployment, Maria reflected on the unexpected path her military career had taken. She had entered the Army as a young woman seeking adventure and purpose. Now, she was being entrusted with responsibilities that could affect the lives of thousands of soldiers she would never meet. The flight back to Afghanistan felt like traveling backward in time, from the air-conditioned offices of Washington to the dust and danger of forward operating bases. But Maria no longer saw this as simply a return to her old life. She was now carrying additional responsibilities and a broader perspective on how individual actions connected to larger policies and decisions. Her teammates welcomed her back with curiosity and concern, wanting to know about her experiences in Washington and what they meant for her future. She shared what she could while being careful not to reveal classified information or create unrealistic expectations about policy changes. "So you're going to be making rules for the rest of us?" Wilson asked with a grin. "I'm going to be helping make sure that rules are practical and realistic," Maria corrected. "The goal is to protect soldiers who have to make tough decisions under tough conditions." As her deployment in Afghanistan wound down, Maria found herself looking at familiar surroundings with new eyes. The forward operating base that had been her home for months now seemed like a laboratory where policies developed in Washington were tested under the most demanding conditions possible. The gap between theory and practice, between policy and reality, was something she would carry with her to her new assignment. Her final patrol in Afghanistan was deliberately routine, a simple supply convoy escort that passed without incident. But even routine operations now carried additional meaning for Maria. Every tactical decision made by every soldier was potentially subject to the kind of scrutiny she had experienced. The challenge would be creating policies that protected both soldiers and civilians, while allowing military operations to accomplish their missions effectively. As her helicopter lifted off from Camp Phoenix for the last time, Maria looked down at the landscape where she had learned so much about herself and her profession. The mountains and valleys below held memories of danger, loss, courage, and friendship that would stay with her forever. But they also held lessons about the complexity of modern warfare and the impossible choices that soldiers faced every day. Those lessons would be her primary contribution to the policy discussions waiting for her in Washington, where the real test of her unexpected journey from soldier to policy advisor was about to begin. 6 months later, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos sat in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the Pentagon, surrounded by legal documents, policy drafts, and coffee cups that had accumulated during another long day of meetings. The Working Group on Rules of Engagement Reform had become her new battlefield, where victories were measured in revised paragraphs and improved clarity rather than lives saved through accurate marksmanship. The transformation from combat soldier to policy advisor had been more challenging than Maria had anticipated. The Pentagon operated according to different rhythms and different measures of success than the forward operating bases she had known. Instead of morning patrols and evening debriefings, her days were filled with committee meetings, legal reviews, and the endless bureaucratic process of turning battlefield lessons into official policy. But the work was important, and Maria had gradually learned to navigate the complex world of military policy development. Her role was to ensure that new rules of engagement reflected the realities that soldiers faced in the field, rather than the theoretical situations that existed only in law books and training manuals. Colonel Sandra Williams, who had become Maria's primary mentor in the policy world, entered the conference room carrying a fresh stack of documents. "We've got feedback from field commanders on the latest draft," she announced. "Most of it is positive, but there are some concerns about implementation." The rules of engagement revision had been a year-long process involving input from legal experts, combat veterans, allied military forces, and civilian oversight organizations. Maria's contributions had focused on ensuring that the new guidelines provided clear, actionable guidance for soldiers facing complex tactical situations like the ones she had encountered in Afghanistan. "What kinds of concerns?" Maria asked, accepting the stack of comments and reviews. "Some commanders worry that the new guidelines are too permissive and might lead to increased civilian casualties. Others think they're still too restrictive and won't adequately protect soldiers who have to make split-second decisions." It was a familiar tension that had characterized every aspect of the revision process. Military operations required flexibility and rapid decision-making, but they also had to comply with international law and maintain public support. Finding the right balance was like threading a needle while riding a roller coaster. Dr. Michael Foster joined them, carrying his laptop and a cup of coffee that he seemed to refill every 30 minutes. "I've got the preliminary results from the simulation exercises at Fort Leavenworth. The new guidelines performed well in most scenarios, but there were some situations where soldiers still struggled with implementation. The simulation exercises were Maria's idea, based on her conviction that policies needed to be tested under realistic conditions before being implemented. She had worked with the Army's training command to develop scenarios that replicated the kinds of complex, ambiguous situations that soldiers actually encountered in combat zones. "What kinds of struggles?" she asked. "Mostly related to time pressure and information uncertainty. When soldiers have to make decisions quickly with incomplete information, even improved guidelines can be difficult to apply consistently." This was the fundamental challenge that had driven the entire revision process. Combat situations rarely provided the luxury of time and complete information that legal frameworks assumed. Soldiers had to make life and death decisions based on partial information, tactical intuition, and split-second assessments of threat and opportunity. Maria had pushed for language in the new rules that explicitly recognized these realities and provided soldiers with clearer guidance about how to make decisions under uncertainty. The goal was to protect soldiers who made reasonable tactical decisions while maintaining appropriate constraints on the use of force. General Chen entered the conference room, and everyone stood to attention. "As you were," he said, waving them back to their seats. I wanted to discuss the timeline for implementation and the training requirements. The general had remained actively involved in the revision process, providing high-level guidance and ensuring that the working group's recommendations would be taken seriously by military leadership. His support had been crucial in overcoming institutional resistance to change. "Sir, we're recommending a phased implementation over 6 months," Colonel Williams reported. Phase 1 would focus on leadership training at the battalion level and above. Phase 2 would extend to company and platoon leaders. Phase 3 would cover all soldiers through unit training programs. "And the training materials?" Maria spoke up. "Sir, we've developed a comprehensive package that includes case studies, simulation exercises, and decision-making frameworks. The key is ensuring that soldiers understand not just what the rules say, but how to apply them in realistic tactical situations." General Chen nodded approvingly. "Staff Sergeant Santos, your emphasis on practical application has been one of the most valuable aspects of this process. How confident are you that these new guidelines will actually help soldiers in the field?" It was a question that went to the heart of Maria's motivations for accepting this assignment. All of the meetings, documents, and bureaucratic processes would be meaningless if they didn't translate into better support for soldiers facing the kinds of situations she had experienced. "Sir, I believe the new guidelines provide clearer decision-making criteria and better protection for soldiers who have to act quickly under combat conditions. They won't eliminate all ambiguity. That's impossible in warfare. But they should reduce the legal uncertainty that soldiers currently face." "And the concerns about civilian protection?" The new guidelines actually strengthen civilian protection by providing soldiers with clearer criteria for threat identification and more specific requirements for minimizing non-combatant casualties. When soldiers are confident about their legal position, they're more likely to take time for careful target identification. Dr. Foster added statistical analysis to support Maria's assessment. The simulation data suggests that soldiers operating under the revised guidelines showed improved civilian casualty avoidance compared to current rules. The clarity appears to enhance rather than compromise civilian protection. General Chen seemed satisfied with their responses. "I'll be briefing the Joint Chiefs next week on our recommendations. This represents the most significant revision to rules of engagement in over a decade, and it's largely based on lessons learned from cases like yours, Santos." After the general left, Maria remained in the conference room to review the latest draft of the implementation plan. The document represented hundreds of hours of work by dozens of people, but it all traced back to those few minutes on an Afghan roadside when she had made split-second decisions that saved her teammates' lives. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very actions that had nearly resulted in her court-martial were now being used as the foundation for policy changes designed to protect other soldiers. The military had a way of learning from its experiences, even when those lessons came at significant cost to the individuals involved. A knock on the conference room door interrupted her thoughts. Captain Jennifer Adams, a young JAG officer who had recently joined the working group, entered with a concerned expression. "Sergeant Santos, I just received a call from a reporter asking about your case and the connection to our rules of engagement revision. How should I respond?" Media attention had been a constant challenge throughout the policy development process. Maria's case had attracted initial coverage, but interest had faded as the story became more complex and technical. However, the approaching implementation of new rules had rekindled journalistic interest. What specifically was the reporter asking about? She wanted to know if the new rules were developed in response to your case, and whether they would have changed the outcome of your investigation. Maria considered her response carefully. The working group's recommendations were based on multiple cases and extensive analysis. Not just her personal experience, but there was no denying that her case had catalyzed the entire reform process. Tell her that the rules revision was based on comprehensive analysis of multiple cases and extensive consultation with field commanders and legal experts. My case was one of many that informed the process. But the new guidelines reflect broad lessons, rather than responses to specific incidents. It was an accurate but incomplete answer that would satisfy the reporter's immediate questions, without getting into classified details about the policy development process. Maria had learned to navigate media inquiries with the same precision she had once applied to long-range marksmanship. Captain Adams nodded and left to handle the media inquiry. Maria returned to her review of the implementation plan, but her thoughts drifted to her teammates back in Afghanistan. Thompson's unit was now on their second rotation since her departure, and several new soldiers had joined the squad. Wilson had been promoted to sergeant and was serving as a team leader. Martinez had returned to the United States for advanced training. Kim had completed his first deployment and was preparing for a second. Each of them would be affected by the policy changes she was helping to develop. The new rules would provide them with clearer guidance and better legal protection, but they would also carry the responsibility of implementing changes that affected the entire military. A text message from her sister Elena interrupted her thoughts. Elena was now a sophomore in college, studying international relations and following her sister's career with pride and curiosity. Her message was brief. Saw the article about military rules changing. Did you really influence Pentagon policy? That's amazing. Maria smiled at her sister's enthusiasm. Elena represented the world that Maria had joined the military to protect, a world where young people could attend college, pursue their dreams, and worry about normal problems instead of IEDs and ambushes. The policy work felt abstract sometimes, but its ultimate purpose was to better protect